to our cross connectors. We are live and in person in the Harrison Room at St. David's Church for Parables and Pints.
Woo!
Woo! Where's that roar? We're so glad you all came out today to be part of this live podcast recording with us. And so we're gonna kick things off. I am your host, Natalee Hill. If you've never met me in person before, it's me.
Wow. In the flesh. I'm Elliot VanHoy. I think I know most of you all here.
And I'm Rick Morley. I think I know you all.
So we are here today to talk about stories.
That's right.
A particular kind of story, the parable.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So what makes the parable a particular kind of story, guys?
So I was going to do this thing, and then I forgot all my props. But if I just said, picture a letter, you can all see it in your head, right? You got the address at the top, you got the deer, you got the body of the letter, you got a date, you got a, sincerely or regards and a signature at the bottom. If I said, picture a thank you note, you can all see the thank you note in front of you. If I said picture an email or a contract, you can all picture what those are in your head because they're ubiquitous. We see them all the time in our lives. And in the ancient world, in Jesus's world, they knew parables like that. Parables were a regular way of communicating. We frequently think about parables, that's something that Jesus did. Mm. And Jesus did do that, but Jesus did that because it was one of the ways that culture communicated. I'll say that the parable is related to the riddle. You may know, like in ancient Greek or Egyptian mythology, there are certain figures that tell riddles, and then the character has to sort of suss out what the meaning of the riddle is. Mm-hmm. The parable, the
Sphinx, right?
There's the Sphinx. Isn't there, when you go across the river Styx, don't you also have to answer a riddle or something like that?
We have to have the coins.
Oh, is that the thing?
And a riddle.
I think a riddle
as well as the coins.
So the parable's related to the riddle in that you have to suss out the meaning. The meaning is not apparent. You have to do some work and figure it out. We can tend in our modern world, as we think about the parables of Jesus, sort of simplify them and think, that they're like allegories. And so you look in the parable and you look like, who's the God figure and who's the me figure, and then what am I supposed to do? Mm. And a couple of the parables can be read as allegories, but that's not the main thing that parables were known for.
Right. So maybe also to help situate this conversation of parables and just give you a working definition of what a parable is. The qualities that a parable contains are narrative, metaphor, and I think this one's interesting in connection to what you're saying, Rick, brevity. The interesting thing about parables is they are what one biblical scholar calls a hot medium. And this is Ellen Davis, an Old Testament scholar, and what she means by a hot medium is that the brevity of the parable, the fact that this is a short kind of punchy story, leaves a lot of room for figuring out what is going on here, right? So when we talk about these parables, there's not a ton of exposition. There's not a ton of details. And so to your point about the riddle, Rick, you kind of hear it and it leaves you going, what's really going on here? What's the purpose here? We're going to get more into Jesus sharing parables, but when he does, most people have no idea what he's talking about, right? The crowds that listen are like, what's the purpose here? Could you maybe try to explain this? So maybe a way to frame it: narrative, metaphor, and brevity.
So now this is different than Aesop's fables.
Mm-hmm.
Aesop's fables, you think of things like the tortoise and the hare. You have the story of the slow-moving tortoise in the race and the hare who is, obviously faster than the tortoise, but he expects to be faster, so he takes all those breaks, and then he crosses the finish line late because he fell asleep. And then it ends with the moral of the story is, right?
Yep.
But parables don't do that. So they're not quite like a fable.
Yeah, so interestingly, the Greek philosopher Aristotle talks about two types of proof that we use. So this might situate why someone would even use a parable in the first place. He says there's two types of proof. One, which consists in relating things that have happened before, and another in inventing them oneself. So one way of trying to prove something to someone is inventing a story to do so. In that category of inventing stories, Aristotle says there's two types of stories we can invent. There's impossible stories, and those are fables, right? So there's a talking spider in a fable. That's impossible. Last time I checked, spiders don't talk to me. The other one he gives...
Well, they don't talk to you.
They don't talk to me.
But they do talk to pigs.
In the fable, they do, right? The second one that he gives are parables. And what's interesting is, as Aristotle defines parables, these are possible stories, right? So for Aristotle, these are things you could imagine happening in your own life. And I think that's a really interesting definition, because when we get to the Hebrew tradition, to the prophets who began using parables, and then to Jesus, this distinction kind of gets collapsed, right? Because on the one hand, you can see Aristotle's definition. There's a neighbor, right? There's someone walking down a road. There's a father, there's a son. These are totally impossible scenarios, right?
Yeah.
And yet what occurs in these stories, a Samaritan helping a Jew who has fallen by the wayside, is ludicrous. It feels impossible given the social context of the world that they're in. So there's a really interesting way, to your point about fables, Natalee, that in Jesus, fables and parables in some way kind of become one thing, right? Does that make sense?
I would add one more thing to what sort of makes a parable, and that's that there's the thing you're supposed to figure out in it, and that thing that you eventually figure out is meant to be disturbing to the current order. And the reason it's hard to say disturbing things, right? And so what's an easier way to say a disturbing thing? Well, it's to tell a story about it where the listener has to figure out what the disturbing thing is. And I think Jesus uses parables the way he does because some of the things he's saying are disturbing.
Definitely.
Disturbing in the sense of like disturbing the order of the day.
Disrupting.
Yeah. And of course, Jesus was a disruptor. It's why he was crucified.
Right.
So, I mean, that's...
So the other thing that I think of when I think of fables is that they're kind of obvious. Like the moral you get from them or the lesson you're supposed to get from them is kind of obvious. When I think of parables, specifically Jesus's parables, is that they're less obvious.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of additional meaning that you can dig into with his. And I don't know if that's unique to Jesus or if that was the way that parables specifically work.
That's part of the inherent nature of a parable, is that it's not simple. It is complex. It's why we've been talking for 2,000 years about Jesus' parables. You know, you have a Sunday where the church, the entire Episcopal Church, the entire Catholic Church, the entire Lutheran Church is reading the parable of the sower, and there's 10,000 sermons, and all of them are different, right? Because it's not just a simple, this means this and that means that. There's more to it.
And some of those sermons are much better than others, aren't they?
Well, that is true too.
I'm sure some of our listeners have heard some crazy interpretations of parables.
Not here. Not here at St. David's.
And then you get people who use that parable of the sower and they write a whole novel kind of imagined out of kind of some of the theme of the parable.
Octavia Butler, right?
Octavia Butler, I'm thinking of her. Yeah. I haven't actually read that. It's on my to be read bookshelf.
Okay. Coming soon to Cross Connections. I will say the one thing, and maybe we can use this point to transition to a parable that everyone knows, the parable so-called of the prodigal son. The interesting thing I want to say is that, remember, for those of you who journeyed with us through the Bible in a year, the Bible does not have headings in it. This comes as a big surprise to a lot of people. So when you have a title for a parable, that is not in the Bible. This is components people have taken out of the story and given as a title because they feel like maybe this is the most important thing in the parable. But it's worth noting, the title itself is an interpretation of the parable, right?
Yeah.
So we'll come back to that.
There could be a title in your Bible, but It's,
Right, it might-
but it was
yeah, yeah, yeah.
it would be an editorial decision, not a
Yes, key
not
distinction.
inherent to the.
You might find it in your Bible, but it is
Right.
not in the original writing of this text. But I did want to say one thing to circle back to what you were saying, Natalie, about fables have these simplistic moral meanings, right?
Right.
And I do think, to problematize just a little bit what you were saying, Rick, but I don't think it contradicts what you were saying. Parables in the ancient world often were used in a kind of simple moralistic way to, remember Aristotle's definition, this is showing you something that could possibly happen and then trying to tell you this is how you should act in your life if this were to happen. I do think, so parables, like we've said, are not unique to Jesus. They were a form of literature, a form of oral storytelling across the ancient world. I do think what you're naming, Rick, is something unique to Jesus's parables, and why I would imagine none of us can probably think of another prolific parable teller. Can you? I mean, I can't. Off the top of my head, I can't think of another person in the ancient world that is remembered today for telling parables.
I'd have to dig. I don't have a seminary education.
But
But
my
it's
point
not,
being,
I mean, you think about Greek myths and stuff. They're not really parables,
right?
I mean, you get some moral meaning out of some of them, but mostly not, because the gods in the Greek.
I mean,
pantheon
and we talked about this in last season as we went through the entire Bible, is that many scholars read the book of Jonah as a parable.
Right.
And that, if you read it as a parable, it is incredibly disturbing. It is an indictment of Israel for not being merciful and gracious as God is. And it's an indictment of us, of judging another and perhaps even wishing death upon that person. And so I don't think it's just inherent to Jesus. I think there were, whoever wrote the book of Jonah wrote a banger of a parable. But Jesus is known for being prolific in writing bangers.
Right.
Do you think Job could be a parable too?
No, I think Job is more wisdom literature. His story is actually a little more fabulistic, and in some sense a little less believable. To Elliot's point about what makes a difference between a fable and a parable. You have God making a wager with Satan and Job losing out on that. We hope that's not how it always works.
It's true. It does seem kind of impossible in some ways. So I guess I was thinking of that.
So maybe it would be helpful to make this a little more specific and share a parable that everyone knows. So I know you.
All right.
We're going to talk a little bit about that one.
So what we're going to do is I'm going to read the parable that is typically known as the prodigal son, although it has other titles to it. And then we're going to look at it through 4 different lenses. Jesus continued, "There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to his father, 'Father, give me my share of the estate.' So he divided his property between them. Not long after that, the younger son got together all that he had and set off for a distant country, and there squandered his wealth in wild living. After he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in that whole country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. When he came to his senses, he said, 'How many of my father's hired servants have food to spare, and here I am starving to death? I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants.' So he got up and went to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. The son said to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. But the father said to his servants, Quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fatted calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. So they began to celebrate. Meanwhile, the older son was in the field. When he came near the house, he heard music and dancing. So he called one of the servants and asked him what was going on. Your brother has come, he replied, and your father has killed the fatted calf because he has sent him back safe and sound. The older brother became angry and refused to go in. So his father went out and pleaded with him. But he answered his father, "Look, all these years I've been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders. Yet you never gave me even a young goat so that I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours, who has squandered your property with prostitutes, comes home, you kill the fatted calf for him." "My son," the father said, "you are always with me, and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found."
Very well known.
Yeah. Love that one. There's so much to dig into with the prodigal.
Do you want to talk about, maybe before we get into the first figure you're going to share in terms of how he understands this parable, maybe some of the ways we typically understand it, some of the things that resonate?
Yeah, I mean, I think the most common, and I think if you ask, 90% of the people sitting in the pews of any church on a Sunday what the parable of the prodigal son's about, it's about, I'm the prodigal son. Like, each of us are the prodigal son. Each of us have messed up, screwed up, blown it, and yet God always comes running towards us and throws his arms around us and brings us home.
Yeah.
Right?
I think some of the, going back to our understanding of parables, some of the impossible things given the social context that are happening in this story that would have shocked Jesus's listeners is the younger son coming to the father and asking for his inheritance, effectively wishing that the father was dead. That moment when he comes to his senses in the pig trough, and we often on first glance will think this is a moment like, oh, he realizes all that he's done wrong. But when you really read the story,
he's starving.
There's not
yeah.
He's like, my father's hired hands have better food.
Living
than this.
better than me. Right.
Has nothing to do with like, I've done anything wrong.
Well, you don't, at least it's not written in any clear sense that means that he's come to his senses. Really, all that it says is that he's realized that he could get a better
some better
deal
food
at
back home.
And so he's going to go home and he's got this story that he's going to give and this apology.
He's like rehearsing it.
Yeah,
Right.
exactly right. Yeah.
But there's no clear sense that apology is genuine. Like,
Right.
it could very well be, but you don't have the narrative does not give you enough to confirm that he actually believes what he's saying to his father. So it could be.
Yeah.
The typical reading also completely misses the older son.
Right.
I mean, I think you asked 90% of the people in the pews, like, what about the older son? What older son?
Yeah. The story ends with the party for most people, right?
Right.
There's the party.
The fatted
whole
calf was
second
killed,
scene.
and that's it.
Right.
But then there's this other son who's like, wait a minute, he gets a party. I've been here the whole time. Why do I get a party? I don't get a calf. I didn't even get a goat. Yeah.
Yeah. Yes.
So
So taking the whole thing is important too, because both pieces of it are informative.
Yeah.
Yep.
So we've talked about, and we're even kind of seeing it here. This is a hot medium, right? Like, even with what you were saying, Natalie, with what is going on in the pig trough. Is he coming to his senses? Is he not? There's a lot you could read into this story. So maybe, Rick, you're going to share a scholar's specific way of reading this story that I'm going to guess nobody in this room would have imagined. Going to take a guess. I'm going to take a guess.
It surprised me.
I think it's pretty like, what are you talking about?
Yeah. And he's not a wild, out there kind of guy.
No, he's an Anglican, in fact.
He's an Anglican bishop. So this is N.T. Wright. N.T. Wright was the Bishop of Durham. He's a New Testament professor, has written a gajillion books. I mean,
some of them are right here in our gift shop and on the table.
Exactly right. He writes scholarly books under the name N.T. Wright, and then he has a whole list of books that are meant for popular audiences. Like, you don't have to have a seminary education to read them, and he writes under Tom Wright when he's doing that.
You don't have to have a seminary education to read the things written under N.T. Wright either.
You don't, but some of his books are kind of.
They're heavier. You got to know what you're getting into.
I will say, I sent one of our listeners in response to a question his 1,000-page book on the resurrection. And I think they were like, this isn't really what I was hoping for.
I've done that move too. So, yeah.
Wow.
Like a little summer reading for you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Do not assign that to me for a podcast episode. It's not going to happen.
So N.T. Wright, he says that The parables of Jesus are primarily stories that retell Israel's story. They are stories that are about the kingdom of Israel. They often look back and hearken back to the stories that we find in the Old Testament. And the themes that constantly come up in the Old Testament and the parables of Jesus are themes like exile, return, faithfulness to the covenant, divine judgment. And so for him, parables are not about individuals. It's not about me. It's not about you. It's about the whole kingdom. So how does he look at this parable, the parable of the prodigal son, which might seem to us as so obviously about an individual, you and me, who are meant to be the prodigal? So he says that this is a retelling of Israel's exile. Not the first exile in Egypt, but the second exile in Babylon, which was brought upon them by being unfaithful. Just like the son was unfaithful and went off to a foreign land, Israel was unfaithful and went off to a foreign land. And just like Israel came home 70 years later, so this son comes home 70 years later. In his reading, the father figure in the parable is still Israel's God. The older brother, he reads in two different ways, and this is interesting. He either reads them as those who didn't go into exile, so the ones who stayed behind, and you may have heard about these people. They're called the Samaritans. But also, he says that they can also be read as Jesus's detractors, the people that when Jesus comes to tell people to come home to God, these are the Pharisees who are always out saying, no, you can't do it your way. You have to do it our way. And he writes, because he sees the story of Israel as also containing the story of Jesus, he says that Jesus is also in this parable. He's not just telling the parable, but he's in the parable. And there's this little detail that is found twice in it, in the text, where the son is called, he was dead, but now he's alive. That shows up twice. And N.T. Wright says, that's Jesus. That is Jesus who went to the exiled land to bring us home. It's not just a moral lesson like, oh, we're supposed to go home after we do the bad thing and God's going to forgive us. But it's the larger story that we have of God always bringing us home to God's kingdom.
So that's a bit of a more modern reading of this parable, not without precedent, of course, but just to show kind of the polyvocal nature of the parables. Here's another way that the parables read. So this is from the 20th century theologian Karl Barth, and Karl Barth is probably the most famous European theologian of the 20th century. If Martin Luther King is the most famous theologian of the 20th century in America, Karl Barth, B-A-R-T-H, though the H is silent, is kind of his counterpart in Europe. He's older than Martin Luther King Jr. There's a wonderful picture of them together online in the 1960s. Encourage you to look that up. But Barth reads this in a way that's a little bit different than Wright, though not totally opposed. And Barth says that all of the parables in the Gospels are ultimately always about Jesus before they are about us. So before we read them and think, oh, I'm in this as some character, he thinks we have to read these, to use a really fancy theological word, Christologically. We have to read them with Jesus at the center of the story. And so like Rick was talking about, with Wright noticing this phrase, the son was dead and now he's alive, Barth says that in this story, Jesus is the one who goes into the far country. So in the same way that Jesus comes from heaven, is incarnate, lives among us, it's paralleled in the son who goes into the far country. And so here's a quote from Barth about parables, and this is his understanding of the parable of the so-called prodigal son. In the going out and coming in of the lost son in his relationship with the Father, we have a most illuminating parallel to the way trodden by Jesus Christ in the work of atonement, to his humiliation and exaltation. So for Barth, when we read this story, the prodigal son is Jesus taking on human existence in all of its brokenness, all of its fallenness, his incarnation, his solidarity and identity with humankind. So when he returns home, this is similar to Jesus's exaltation. And then Bart reads the older brother as those who are rejecting Jesus Christ doing this for them, right? Just as the older brother says, God, how could you do this? These are people in Jesus's own context that feel like, how could God come into broken humanity, right? That is not what God would do. So there's another way of reading this, right? He's a little less focused on N.T. Wright's way, in which this is all about exile and Israel, right? When he reads this parable, really connects it to Ezra and Nehemiah, right? Those stories of the return, and Isaiah. So just some different ways to read it. But for Bart, the real focus is the work of Jesus. So I gotta say it just personally, I'd never read the story this way until I read Karl Barth's interpretation of it. Yes, parables are about Jesus. He's the one telling them. Oftentimes we see the word father in parable and we're like, oh, that's God. Like God's got to be the father, right? That's what we call God. But to really see in the parable Jesus as this lost son, when I first read it, I was like, that's a shocking interpretation of this parable.
Yeah.
I don't know how you guys read a little bit of his interpretation, so I don't know how it hit you both.
I've found like all of these interpretations, even the one I'm going to share, not at all what I would have expected at any of them. I was like, wow, what are we?
Yeah.
People are thinking about it in ways it didn't occur to me to think of it.
Mm-hmm. So what interpretation do you have for us, Natalee?
I'm bringing you the interpretation of Frederick Buechner, who was an American writer and theologian, also modern. He only died in 2022. Born in 1926. So he imagines parables as comedy. Mm-hmm. He sees them as comedy, where impossible things, God does outlandish things with impossible people. And it was really interesting reading his interpretation of this particular parable. I started to think back to, I bring this up regularly, my theater education. I started to imagine the characters as performers in the Commedia dell'arte. I don't know if any of you all are familiar with Commedia dell'arte, but French tradition, or at least it originates in France, and all of the characters are caricatures of people. There's mask involved, and they're often very distorted. You'll have characters with big, long noses and scrunched up faces, and then the performers, in their costumes and in their physicality, they're very exaggerated. They will lead very specifically with certain parts of their bodies in order to exaggerate like the stereotype that they're filling. And so I started to think of it in that way, as he talked about like the prodigal son the son who goes away doesn't necessarily know or hasn't really come to a realization that he needs reconciliation, or needs to repent of what he's done. But he goes back, and then the father is just absolutely ridiculous in how he responds in this way that makes no sense, that nobody would expect the father would respond in that way. But then he even talks about the older son and how absurd the older son is, where you can actually look at the older son's behavior. And usually when you read this story, you think of the older son as the one who's so perfect and he did everything right. He even says that, I was with my father, I was with you all the time, and I never got these things. But Buechner's like, well, look at the way in which, if you can read into it, look at all the sins he's committing. The sin of envy.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Pride.
The sin of pride.
Anger.
The sin of anger. He even goes as far as to say that that there's some lust in there because of like the way, like imagining the other brother with the...
He's the only one who gives the detail of the prostitute.
Right, with the exactly.
Yeah, Luke doesn't even go there.
Right.
But the older brother is. Right.
And
He's imagining this, yeah.
and
That struck me for the first time when you read it today. I had never heard that in the telling of this story.
Yeah.
So I'm glad you brought that up for Buechner. Like it hit me as comic when you read it today.
Yeah.
right. And then sloth, and the fact that it, in some ways, the older brother almost wishes the father dead as well.
Yes.
So you don't realize that in the first reading of it. So it was just really interesting to think of them as like really bizarre comedic characters, that like caricatures that make you stop and think about like what's going on here, and is the doddering fool of a father such a fool? Like, who do we relate to? Do we relate to this so sinful older brother who's presumably done it all right? Do we relate to the younger brother who receives forgiveness out of nowhere from nothing?
Very completely different from the two we just presented.
Yeah.
Completely different. I was like, wow.
Yeah.
So like I said, read all these are really different ways of reading this parable I wouldn't have expected.
I think it really highlights one of our main themes tonight is that there are so many ways you can read a parable. And going back to a previous episode when we listened to a lecture by Matthew Novenson, I think part of our project on Cross Connections is recognizing there is not one right way to read the Bible. This is not to say there are not wrong ways. Of course, I think we would all agree there are ways to read the Bible in a false way. But so many of the stories in the Bible, so many of the books, there are so many ways to get into them and so many ways to approach them.
Which is why when I talked about the similarity and the heritage of that parables share with riddles, I said in the similarity is that the meaning is not apparent. In riddles, there is one answer, right? There's not 15 answers to a riddle. There's one answer. But in a parable, the meaning is not inherent, but there could be multiple meanings.
Yeah, absolutely.
One of the things I didn't share was one of the last things that Buechner says, because I'm like, okay, if this is all a big joke, what's the point of the joke? The way that Buechner describes the point of the joke is, blessed is he who is not offended, that no man receives what he deserves, but vastly more. Blessed is he who gets that joke, who sees the miracle.
Absolutely.
So just in case you're wondering, like, if it's all a big joke, what's the point of the joke?
Yeah.
I did have a former parishioner who was a classmate of his, and I mentioned him in a sermon one time, and he was like, "Oh, Fred." Yeah. So
Well, that brings us to the shining figure and interpreter of parables tonight. And part of the reason we actually did this is Peter Rollins. So some of you may be familiar. We talked about Peter Rollins in January when we first brought Cross Connections out of reading the Bible for an entire year. And what did we do? We went straight into a really intense thinker and talked about who and what is God, naturally. So our inspiration for tonight was a book. The book is called The Orthodox Heretic and Other Fables or Other Tales. He doesn't use the word parable, but the book is all about parables. And in fact, he tells parables. So this is his definition of parable, and it's pretty intense. A parable is a lyrical discourse that inspires and transforms us. What is a discourse? A discourse is that form of miscommunication that sends us spinning off course and onto a new course. So one of the things for Rollins, and what we've been talking about this entire time tonight, is parables, insofar as there is always many meanings to them, are always a miscommunication. There's always so many ways of understanding them. There's so many ways of spinning us off in new directions. So one of the things Rollins does to confront us with this is retells many of the parables. So I'm going to read to you, really briefly, his retelling of this parable we've been sharing. There once was a rich and kindly father who lived with his 2 sons in a lavish mansion. But late one evening, in the very dead of night, the father packed a few small items and left quietly. The first son awoke the next day, and upon discovering his father's disappearance, continued with his chores religiously. Days passed into months, and these months gradually dissolved into years. Through toil and rationalization, this son successfully repressed the haunting fact that the father had abandoned them. Instead of facing the pain, he allowed the reality of the situation to fester silently in the depths of his being. The other son also refused to face up to the pain of his father's midnight exodus. In confusion and fear, he withdrew his share of the father's inheritance and ran away, losing himself in worldly distractions of all kinds. But He found that no matter where he traveled, he could not escape the sorrow in his heart, and no matter what activity he engaged in, the amnesia it offered was not enough to cloud the memory of his father's disappearance. In addition to this, he soon found himself utterly destitute and poor. After only a few years, he found himself without money or friends, working on a pig farm, where he would have to share the scraps that he fed to the animals in order to supplement his diet. After many months of this pitiful existence, he decided to face up to his father's disappearance and return home. When he finally reached the great mansion, he found his brothers still caring for the property, still toiling on the land, still suppressing the memory of their father's exodus. The brother who had never left held resentment in his heart against the one who had, squandered his inheritance only to return empty-handed. However, the other brother paid no heed to this animosity, for his gaze was set upon a deeper concern. Each day he would carefully ready a calf for slaughter and lay out his father's favorite cloak in preparation for a great feast of celebration. Once he had done this, he would then sit by the entrance of the mansion and passionately await the father's return. He waits there still to this very day, yearning for the homecoming of the prodigal father with longing and forgiveness in his heart.
Ooh.
Very different than the original parable.
That's actually one of 2 rewritings of that parable that Rollins does in the book.
That is.
Although the other one is a little less drastic.
So what hits you in that parable?
Yeah, I mean, Rollins does this thing where he plays with God's presence. And as sort of a classic philosopher, he plays with language and words. And does this come from the second part of the book?
Can't remember.
The second movement of the book is called God is Nowhere.
Yes,
and all the letters are smushed together, so there's no space in between the words God is nowhere. And if you look at God is nowhere also says God is now here. So you can read, because there's no space between the words, you can read it both ways. Mm-hmm. And so he's always playing with this God who feels absent and yet this God who is present. And you can see him doing that in this parable.
Right. I think what struck me the first time I read this is, for Rollins, he recognizes we put ourselves in the parable, right? When we read the original story, we see ourselves as the prodigal son, or maybe we even see ourselves as the elder brother. I've talked to many people that do feel like the elder brother, the person that's shown up to church, the person that's been involved, and maybe they know someone that hasn't been. So we put ourselves in one or the other. And I think what he does is he uses that fact that we put ourselves there. And he says, how do we deal with God when we feel like God is not present to us? Like you were saying, he's always playing with God's presence or absence. And many of us, I'm sure, know that feeling, that sense of I'm praying, but is God really listening? I'm showing up to church, but am I really feeling or experiencing transformation? And what struck me in this parable, it really is that vivid description of the 2 brothers and the way that they respond to that. There's the one that just religiously goes through the chores and the religious rituals and is resentful. And then there's this other brother who handles it by going out and living riotously, but then comes back and is still faithful to the father, even as he feels that the father has abandoned him.
Yeah, the older brother goes through like the movements, but he's completely cut off from the father. Like he's, as he said, he kind of like comes to terms with it by like avoiding it, like just creating this big barrier between.
And ritualizing it, like having the fatted calf ready all the time.
Yep.
In a sense, that's a form of presence, right? Like that his father is always present to him, so he's always getting this meal ready, and it never quite gets there, and so we have to do it again another time. And there are so many ways that we do that in our own lives as we sort of ritualize the presence.
Right.
So just really quickly, and I know you two are going to share some more of Rollins' parables. This whole book is a series of parables. So he tells many parables. Not all of them are rooted in the parables of Jesus, but this one is, as we've been talking about, the parable of the prodigal son. And if you're hearing this parable, and when I first heard it, I kind of felt like, who are you to say that God has abandoned these 2 sons in this story, right? It feels like he's trying to disturb a little bit, which you said Jesus was too.
Yeah.
So maybe that's fair. But at first I had a little bit of like, What are you doing here? And he describes each parable a little bit afterwards. He gives a little context of where this came from. And he says when he wrote this parable that he had in his mind Christ's call from the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me? The absence of God as testified to in this prayer is not the result of God's being perceived as transcendent, but rather the feeling of God's withdrawal in the hour of need. It was this latter experience I had in mind when I wrote this story, and how often we also might share with Christ in that feeling of God's absence. And you wrote a letter about that recently.
Yeah.
You talked about how you'll pray for God's presence, and someone said to you, "Isn't
God's always
here?"
present,
Right?
right? Yes. Yeah.
And would you say just a little bit, because I really liked what you said in that letter about why do you pray for God's presence then? If someone says, well, Rick, God is always here.
Because sometimes God doesn't feel like God is present.
Yeah.
I mean, if you talk to just real people out there that are going through hard things in their lives, they will tell you they feel alone. They feel like they have been praying and God has not been answering. And as a Christian praying for God to be here, it says that God isn't here and that God is, right? It's holding on to
tension.
both.
Yeah. We don't like tensions a lot of the times.
We want religion to be simple, just like we want the parables to be simple.
We just want the whole Bible to be simple.
Yeah, but when we're dealing with God, we're talking about an infinite being, right? And if a being at all, as per one of our prior
Take it easy.
Okay.
Stick with the parables. So there's some other parables he shares, and I know Rick recommended this book, so I know you wanted to share one of your personal favorites.
It is one of my personal favorites, and it is a provocative one, and it is provocatively titled Salvation for a Demon. So the parable, I'm not going to read it. I'm going to give sort of my own telling of it. There was this medieval village that had sort of passed its prime. Its glory days were in the rearview mirror. But in the center of this incredible medieval town, there was an incredible medieval cathedral. And it was gnarled and it was black and with the ages and carved. And in that cathedral, there was a faithful old priest. And that faithful old priest was faithful with his prayers, but he was also faithful in receiving whoever came to the doors of that cathedral. And in the ancient tradition of the church, received every stranger as if that person was Christ himself. And so on one stormy night, the priest is in the cathedral and he's praying before the cross, doing his normal evening prayers, when there is a thunderous knock against the doors of the cathedral. And so the priest gets up from his prayers and he goes and he opens the door. And he is startled to see this towering figure, this demon before him, who is like oozing acid and looking horrific. And the demon says, "Priest, will you welcome me into your church?" And the priest says, "Well, sure, anyone's welcome into this church. You can come right on in." And so the demon comes into the church and the priest closes the door. And then the priest just goes back to the cross and continues with his evening prayers while the demon is going around smashing icons and smashing stained glass windows and uttering blasphemies. And then the priest makes the sign of the cross and gets up from his evening prayers and starts heading towards the door. And the demon says, "Priest, where are you going?" And the priest says, "Well, I'm hungry and tired, and so I'm going to go home for dinner and to sleep." And the demon says, "Priest, will you welcome me into your home?" And the priest says, "Sure, of course. Anyone's welcome into my home." And so they go across the street to the rectory and go in, and the priest closes the door, and the priest begins cooking a meal, and the demon is going around smashing the pictures of Jesus on the wall and uttering blasphemies and using all kinds of profanity. And the priest is just doing his business and finishes cooking a simple but hearty meal. And the priest and the demon sit down at this table and they eat dinner together. And then the priest stands up to go to bed. And the demon says, "Priest, you've welcomed me into your church. You've welcomed me into your home. Will you welcome me into your heart?" And the priest says, "Well, of course." And at that, the demon recoiled and ran to the door, and like a bolt of lightning fled into the night, because the one thing that the demon came to take from the priest was the one thing that the priest was not willing to give up: his kindness and his grace and his hospitality. No one knows what has become of this demon, but the priest went to bed that night, and as he dozed off, he mused to himself and wondered, in which guise would Christ come to him next? That's the end of the parable. That's it. That's all I got.
You told it so theatrically. I love it. Just beaming over here. It's great. It's such a cool parable.
It is.
It really surprised me too.
It is
I was like,
provocative
oh,
from the
yeah.
outset. I mean, it's provocative in the sense that the priest would invite this demon in. I mean, that's a wild thought, right? And that it makes a good point, but then that resolution at the end is even the more provocative, that perhaps this demon could actually be Christ in disguise. Yeah.
Especially given like all of the damage and all of that, and he just takes it all in stride.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think the other thing about that parable that struck me when I first read it was it seems like one of the things Rollins is concerned with in a lot of his work is recognizing maybe something Gandhi put pretty well, which is, I love your Christ, but I don't know about your Christians. And which is another kind of striking, in a way, parable, a parable of real life. And I think what Rollins does there is, at no point does the priest care. Like when you're reading it, the demon is going around smashing icons, ripping down crosses, destroying this beautiful cathedral. And the priest never does anything.
No.
And almost as you're reading it, you're like, what are you doing? Stop him. This is this gorgeous cathedral. This is this place of community. What are you doing? And there's this radical hospitality that the priest extends. And that's what Rollins is trying to get to. What do you care about more?
What's the heart of what we're doing? Is it the building? Is it the stuff? Or is it the kindness and compassion and hospitality that Christ commands us to show? There's the part of the longer quote that you quoted from Rollins on parables. I think this is really helpful for this parable. He says, religious writing is usually designed to make the truth of faith clear, concise, and palatable. Parables subvert this approach. In the parable, truth is not expressed via some dusty theological discourse that seeks to educate us, but rather it arises as a lyrical discourse that would inspire and transform us. In light of this, the enclosed parables do not seek to change our minds, but rather change our hearts. And so this parable is not asking us, oh, it'd be interesting to consider what it would be like to have a greater theology of hospitality. It's asking, who are we going to welcome in? And how fully are we going to welcome them into our community, our home, and our very lives? And are we willing to give all as Christ gave? Are we willing to give all of ourselves to that end?
One of the most disturbing points is when the demon asks to be let into the priest's heart.
Yeah.
And you're like, oh, all the way in. Like, that's the place that Christ belongs.
Right.
But the priest sees the demon as potentially Christ.
Yep.
Yeah.
And that's just like, oh, wow.
I said this when Rick and I were first talking about this parable. I said what it reminded me of is the French story Les Mis. And in the beginning of that story, there's a priest, very much like the priest of this story, a very kindly, homely country priest who has this radical hospitality. And there, Jean Valjean, right?
Yeah.
The main character of Les Mis is fresh off the prison boat, escaped, right?
Yep.
Of course, he didn't do much. All he did was steal some bread to feed his family. And yet he's been this man in prison that has become hardened by the prison system. And he comes to this priest's home. and he steals all
the candlesticks.
The candlesticks.
Just start with
just the candlesticks. That's right. And then what does the priest do? He says, "Oh, take it all, right? Like take this, take this, take this."
Well, someone finds them in his bag and is like, "He stole them from you." And it's a cardinal. The cardinal says, "I gave them to him."
Mm-hmm.
You know?
And he says, "Not only did I not only,
you forgot
but
these.
you forgot these things
You
as well,"
forgot.
and brings more. Yeah.
Right.
Which is a big
changed
turning
his
moment
heart.
for Valjean.
The parable is not just meant to change our minds, but to change our action. And that moment changed Valjean's very life.
Yeah.
His heart, yeah.
So you're going to wrap us up with a final parable, Natalee?
Yeah, so I went with one that disturbed me. I picked one. It's called The Mission of Judas. And it's fairly short, but the summary of it is that while the other disciples are preparing for the Passover feast, the implication is that we're talking about the Last Supper feast here, what will become. Judas falls asleep, and he has this terrible vision. In his dream, he sees everything that he's going to do, everything that we know in the Bible that he's going to do, the betrayal of Jesus. He sees them all breaking bread together the next day. He sees his betrayal. He sees Jesus's death. He sees how all of his fellow disciples respond to what's happened, how they curse his name forever. He sees his own death, but he also then sees the resurrection, and he sees the ascension, and he sees what comes of Christ's ministry in the future. And he wakes up in like a cold sweat, realizing that this is his call. This is his mission. That really disturbed me because of the way in which I love these kinds of like midrashes of like getting into the minds of biblical characters and trying to think what they're thinking or what they could be thinking. But Rollins points out that there's like little moments in the biblical text that sort of call into question whether there was some knowledge of what was going on, and whether any of this was planned ahead. If Jesus and Judas had actually talked about this betrayal and intended for it to happen,
right?
The way, thy will be done, or there's a way in which like Jesus knew that this all had to take place.
Yeah.
In order for this to happen. And so did he bring Judas in on it in some way? Was Judas disturbed by the way in which he was brought into it? And what does it mean for us? The thing I really was disturbed by is, what does it mean for us to go through our lives watching what's happening in the modern day and knowing where to sit? Like, Judas's actions seem obviously wrong in the moment. One of the things as I continued to ponder this as I was going to bring it, I love to bring in pop culture references. One of the characters that I started to think of is Snape from the Harry Potter series. And, not a spoiler, these books and movies have been out for a very long time, but there's a character, Severus Snape, who through all of the books,
it's like the epitome of evil.
He's a teacher at the Hogwarts, the school. He seems like this. He's not the ultimate evil in the book series, but he seems really especially evil because he's so close to Harry, who's the main character. And you do get other people's perspectives sometimes in the book, but mostly you're seeing things through Harry's perspective. And as you're going through these 7 books or 8 films, you are led to believe that Snape is this really bad guy. He seems to be in league with the ultimate bad, he who shall not be named Voldemort. And he does horrible things. He ultimately kills good people. But as you come through the story, and Harry questions because Snape continues to be trusted by people who Harry believes he's supposed to also trust. And so he's so confused by this character being trusted. And ultimately it turns out that Snape had been in on it all along, and he had to do these horrible things. And he felt so deeply gutted about the way he had to behave, the way he had to, kill people.
Yeah.
Like people that he would have cared about in order for this larger mission to take place. And ultimately, Harry does come to find out like that was the truth of him. And like in the very, very end, he names one of his kids after the guy. But you don't know that for so long. And so I think about the way that we often operate. Like when we're reading it, we're almost like the Harry Potters reading about Judas. And we don't really know what's going on. Is he a Snape? Or is he something else entirely? Like it's so hard to know. And it just really disrupts that whole like, so how do you go about the world? Like you want to do what Harry does, which is constantly combat the thing that seems so clearly bad and evil and un-Christ-like, right? As we would say. But gosh, to think that there's something else at work behind that is distressing.
The phrase that Rollins uses over and over again to talk about this, what he thinks that Judas might have done or something that Snape would have done, is he says there's a fidelity of betrayal. That sometimes the betrayal is the right thing to do. He has a book called Fidelity of Betrayal. It's my favorite of his books. Here's it's a quick quote from this. He says, "There are countless people who betray Christianity, individuals who turn their backs on its message because they no longer believe in it or because it asks too much of them. But there are a few who betray Christianity, not because they no longer believe in it, but because they believe in it so deeply, because they understand that unless the seed of our Christianity falls to the ground and dies, it will remain a single seed. But if it is allowed to die, it will produce many seeds."
There was another one of these parables that I almost wanted to read that was very much along those lines. And it had to do with a mentor and a disciple of that mentor. And it dealt with that exactly. Yeah. The disciple of the mentor kept saying, like, I will never betray you. I will always follow in your footsteps. And the mentor is like, if you do that, it will be a betrayal because you're supposed to go beyond me. You're supposed to take everything I learned and everything I taught you and go beyond that. And if you stay only with that, that's a form of betrayal.
Yeah.
I was like, oh, wow, that's an interesting way to think about it too.
Definitely. That's, I think, a good point to wrap up here in just a second. And any closing remarks on parables before we do questions?
I want to turn it to the people.
Well, that's what I meant.
Yeah,
Wrap up for questions. Yeah.
I think we're ready for some questions.
I definitely think so too.
All right.
So if you have a question,
we've primed you with beer and pizza. So
and
the questions
not
better
sleepy
be good
at all after all that beer.
The intent is questions about this particular subject matter, but if you want to ask questions about other stuff, please do.
So first I want to say the prodigal son parable has caused me so much heartburn in my life. That's a different story. So why do scholars think that the parables are so easily misinterpreted? Or why would Jesus be telling these stories that by definition, like nobody that he was talking to would understand? What was the point of all that?
What's the point of telling stories that Jesus even knows that people won't understand?
Yep.
Yeah, well, what's the point of stories?
I mean, I'm not sure. I feel like I've said this before, but I can't. I can't remember to who. If Jesus wanted this faith to be easy, he would have just said, "All right, guys, here's the deal," and he would have just given us the deal.
10 quick bullet points for a better life.
Exactly right. If he wanted us to know exactly what the death and resurrection was all about, he would have said, "All right, guys, here's the deal. I'm going to tell you what it's all about." If he had like 3 points for how to live a better life, he would have told us that. But I think part of what he wanted to do was he gathered a community together to then struggle and learn together and figure out what this path is.
I mean, I think he did sometimes actually lay it all out. And like it's written in there and the disciples still didn't understand. But yeah, no, I think part of it is, I think it comes back to some degree to like that whole, free will sort of conversation. I think that Jesus wants us to come up with the answers ourselves. Jesus wants us to sit with what we've been told and digest it and think it through. I think he's honoring the people with their intelligence. Like, come on, you know how to think about this, which kind of also, that makes me think of the way in which that God is like, I'm here and I love you, but you come to me when you're ready for me. I'm going to keep coming to you too. But
Stories with depth can also be told at different levels. So today was the pre-K and kindergarten graduation for St. David's Episcopal Day School. And we've been hanging out with the students over there, and we're able to talk about the parables and tell to preschoolers, like, here's this father and this son, and goes away and he comes back and he gets a big hug, and a 3, 4, 5-year-old can understand it at that level. When you have a story that has depth, you're able to do that, but then go to the next level, and then go to the next level, and then go to the next level. If it was really just like 5 points for a better life, that would be it. And some of those points might not speak to the little children who learn in the building next door to us.
And you remember them.
Yeah.
There's something about being told the story in that way that's so kind of like, what? That you're going to remember it better than you might a bulleted list.
I always joke to Rick in youth group, we read the gospel from the previous Sunday in church, and I'll often ask the youth group kids, middle schoolers and high schoolers, so what did Rick preach about? And they're like, I don't know, but he told this story at the beginning of the sermon, right? Like, people do remember stories. There's definitely something about stories.
It's like music.
It is like music. People remember hymns more than they remember any sermon. No doubt about that.
Why the theology of your hymnody is so important.
I do have a thought, though, Danielle, to your question. And it is a troubling question to some degree, I think, at least as I hear your question of, there seems to be baked into this confusion, and that doesn't seem very helpful. And I think one of the interesting, bizarre, and at times troubling components of the Gospels is that Jesus will often ask people, who do you say that I am? Right? And people will say, well, you're a prophet. You're like Elijah. You're like Moses. You're this person. And then there will be some that say, you're the Christ, right? You're the Messiah. And do you know what Jesus often says to those people after they say, you are the Christ?
Tell no one.
Tell nobody. Yes. Don't go tell anyone. And you're reading that and you're like, what the heck is going on here? Why wouldn't this person has realized, apparently in a sea of people who have not, because most people just could not figure this out. Why wouldn't you want that person to go tell people? And it's this, scholars have recognized this and they call it the Messianic secret. And Mark, of all gospels, has most prominently this constant refrain of don't tell anyone, don't tell anyone, and my point with saying that is oftentimes this is paired with the parables. Usually when these scenes are happening are around the same time that Jesus is telling parables. And the gospel authors all are like, Jesus told this parable. Oh, and nobody understood it. In fact, the parable of the sower, the one where there's the seed on the rocky soil, the seed on the good soil, the seed on, there's the seed that the bird comes and takes. I don't know about you guys. When I read that parable, I am like, what is the point here? What's going on? And in fact, so did the disciples. And that's one of the parables, because some of them will then have an explanation. Have you caught that? That's one where they're like, Jesus, you gotta tell us what's going on here. And he's like, okay, you know what? Fine. I'll lay this out a little bit more for you. And he gives the explanation of what each seed is, right? It's one who's heard the word and then goes away. It's one, et cetera, et cetera. I won't repeat the parable, but I think you all have really helpfully named why this is going on. But I'll end by saying, I'm pretty young. My dad is still in my life, and I love my dad deeply. My dad's a construction worker, incredibly salt of the earth guy. He likes to teach lessons. Anyone have a dad like that? He really wants you to learn a lesson. And so when I was growing up as a construction worker, he was like, Elliot, you have to learn how to do things with your hands. You have to fix things yourself. And he would tell me this ad nauseum. Do you think I ever wanted to fix anything? No. I want to take it to the shop. I want to get it fixed. Long story short, I have come into a period of my life where your own son, Danielle, has helped me fix Jess's car. I recently spent an exorbitant amount of money on a bike stand so I could start working on my bike. The point is, over 30 years of life now, that lesson has set in a way that just telling me to do something hasn't. When he told me that ad nauseum, I was just like, dude, shut up. I don't care. But, and I think parables are trying to ignite that spark where transformation is entering in a subliminal, unconscious way, right? Like it's lighting the spark where you're going to take this story home. You're going to ruminate on it. You're going to think about it. You're going to think about, how does God relate to this story? How do I relate to this story? And it's going to change depending on where you are in life, right? Like if we're reading the parable of the prodigal son in a way that we're within it, there's been times I'm like, I'm the prodigal son. And there's been other times where I'm like, I am the elder brother for sure. So I think that's the other thing about stories. And I read lots of novels. Like every time I read a novel and then I return to it 3 years later, 5 years later, I like get something new out of it in a totally new way. So I don't know if that helps.
Yeah. I was going to say ours is a storytelling faith too. I
Yeah.
mean, from the Israelites. Yeah.
One of the things that it seems to be the great question of the day is, what is truth? The Bible certainly warns against false prophets. Are there any parables that talk about discerning truth? Or, I mean, I know there's a lot of sections in the New Testament that help us, but is there...
Goodness. The first thing I thought of, so Jay's asking about discerning false prophets. The first thing I thought of actually was one of Peter Rollins's parables, which was an interesting one. Again, it was another one I was like, oh, that's interesting. Maybe tell that. Where there's this prophet and the devil doesn't want the prophet to be successful in telling people what's coming up and what's going on. So the devil makes it so that the prophet is extremely beautiful. And no matter what she says, all of the disturbing things that she brings to people's light to like try to get them to move and to go, they can't see past how beautiful she is and how graceful she is and how well spoken she is. They're not hearing the message because they're distracted by the way that the message is being packaged. So sometimes the packaging is a distraction from the message, whichever direction the message goes. So sometimes you have to kind of pull away the packaging and like really focusing in on what is it that you're hearing. What is it that you're hearing and what's underneath what you're hearing? And where is what you're hearing coming from? And how does that sit with what else you know?
That makes me think about, with your question, Jay, I don't know that there's an individual parable I can think of off the top of my mind that relates to discernment of truth. That being said, I might want to say that I think all of the parables as parables are forcing us to discern truth in a unique way. And this is what I mean. Do you know the audience, this might be an unfounded claim, I'm going to have to go look this up afterwards, but I'm going to risk it and I'm going to go for it. Do you know the audience that I think it's fair to say is usually the recipient of parables, other than the disciples, the main audience?
The Pharisees.
The Pharisees. So Jesus is often, we often put ourselves in, Jesus is telling us these parables, and that's fair. We pick up the Bible and we read it as being told to us. But if we're looking at the context, and actually the context of Luke 15, the parable of the prodigal son, is that Jesus is telling all of these things specifically to the religious leaders and Pharisees. So what is the problem that Jesus is recognizing with the Pharisees and the religious leaders? Their discernment of truth, their false discernment of truth, right? And for Jesus, and Luke 15 is the perfect one because he tells three parables back to back, right? There's the parable of the lost sheep, there's the parable of the lost son, and then there's the parable of the lost coin. And I think what's interesting is when it comes to discerning truth, Jay, what I would want to say is, especially when we're looking at Luke 15, what Jesus is saying to the Pharisees in that context is you have really failed to discern the truth of what God is like and what God is doing, right? Because they want to put exclusion on what God is doing. Because in all of these parables, there's something that has got lost. There's a son that's gone away. There's a sheep that's been lost. There's a coin that's been lost. And in each of those parables, and this is what I really love about Buechner, there is this preposterous understanding of God as the one who goes out for that lost sheep, runs out to meet the lost son, and is a woman that's searching for this lost coin, right? And I think what Jesus is doing in that is saying, if we are discerning truth in a way that is understanding God as a God that casts out those on the margins, we have discerned truth in a wrong way. So that's a little bit, I think,
There's also, among those three parables, is that there's a joy to truth. All three parables, there's a
Rejoicing.
celebration afterwards. The fatted calf is killed. There's a celebration after the sheep is found, and the woman who finds this coin then goes and spends more than the coin was worth to go throw a party. And and so there's something to it's not just truth is I found the right answer, but truth is look what we found together, and let's throw a party about it.
Definitely. That's a great question. Yeah. The relationship.
There is a Peter Rollins parable. It's a short one. So you might know that in like rabbinical school, like the way of teaching is by argument. And so you are meant to show up and argue. Even if you don't believe in your position, you argue that position, and then you change your position and get another
It's like debate
one.
class.
Sounds like me in college.
Yeah, that is definitely. Did you go to rabbinical school? Okay.
Southern Baptist College.
Okay, close enough.
Yeah, I guess.
So his parable is there were these two rabbis, and they were arguing about this finer point of the law, and they argued day and night, and they argued in the market, and they argued in the synagogue, and they argued in the streets, and people got mad at them for always, like they were never together, and they weren't arguing about this point and going back and forth and pitting their various students against each other to argue this point. And finally, not only was everyone in the town so fed up, but God was fed up with the arguing of these two rabbis. And so God came down and appeared to them and said, all right, I'm going to settle this argument. And the rabbi said, who do you think you are to come here and settle our argument? Get out of here. We're still talking about this. And so there's something to... that parable is talking about like objective truth, which we are obviously all looking for, but there's also the community that is seeking to find out what that truth is. And there's a better way than just having truth beamed into our heads, and that's figuring it out together with love. And then throwing a party.
And then throwing
with
a
some
party.
beer and some pizza and a fatted calf.
We forgot the calf.
Yeah. No calves. No calves tonight.
Sorry. Well, I'm so excited you all came here tonight. Thank you so much for being here. Let's get a hand for all of you.
Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for joining us.
See you next time.
And we'll be here next time. Whether we see you or not, it's
Up for question.
we're glad to see you this time.
Very fun. All right.
All right.
Beer and pizza.
Until then. If you didn't listen in last season, we went through and discussed the Bible from cover to cover. That's from Genesis to Revelation, and you can find all of those episodes up now wherever you listen to podcasts. Be sure to follow or like us on your favorite podcasting app to find us easily each week, or join our email list at stdavidschurch.org/crossconnections. We love getting your questions. Please call us at 484-588-5656 and leave a voicemail with your name, where you're from, and your question or comment. You can also email questions to us at crossconnections@stdavidschurch.org. If you like what you hear, please share this episode with your friends and rate us in Spotify and Apple Podcasts so other people can find us as well. And if you really love what you hear, we'd be ever so grateful if you would donate to St. David's Church. You can visit our website at stdavidschurch.org/giving and write Cross Connections in the memo line to indicate your support. Cross Connections is a ministry of St. David's Episcopal Church in Wayne, Pennsylvania, and is hosted by
Rick Morley.
Elliot VanHoy.
and Natalee Hill. Logo graphic design and podcast production by Natalee Hill. Stock media music provided by Marscott and Mood Mode Pond 5. You're welcome to learn more about all of St. David's worship and ministries at stdavidschurch.org. That's stdavidschurch.org. Thanks. See you next week.